Hi everyone, thank you for coming out today. Like Tracy said, I'm Jacob Murray. I'm from the James A. Garfield National Historic Park just down the road, and I am here to give us a talk about the Reconstruction Era National Historic Network. I thank you all for coming out today. Looks like we have a nice turnout. Now, the Reconstruction Era from 1861 to 1900 was the historic period in which the U.S. grappled with the question of how to integrate millions of newly freed African Americans into social, political, and labor systems, as well as a time of significant transformation within the U.S. itself. Leading historian Eric Foner has called Reconstruction both America's unfinished revolution and the violent, dramatic, and still controversial era that followed the Civil War. Reconstruction began when the first United States soldiers arrived in slaveholding territories and enslaved people escaped from both plantations and farms. Some of them fled north into free states, while others found their safety among the U.S. forces. During that period, Congress passed 3 constitutional amendments that permanently abolished slavery, defined birthright citizenship, and guaranteed due process under the law, as well as granted all males the ability to vote by prohibiting voter discrimination based on race, color, or previous conditions of servitude, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, respectively. Congress also passed a series of Reconstruction Acts that divided the former Confederacy into 5 military districts and laid out requirements for their readmittance into the Union, all save Tennessee. The experience of Reconstruction and the rebuilding of the Union following the American Civil War played out all across the U.S. and resulted in changes that fundamentally altered the meaning of citizenship and the relationship between the federal and state governments. Central to this drama was the former Confederacy, where social, economic, and political changes dramatically transformed the region and where major activities of resistance to Reconstruction took place. African Americans across America as a whole faced steep obstacles as they attempted to claim their newly won rights. Ultimately, the unmet promises of Reconstruction led to the modern civil rights movement only 100 years later. Despite the importance of Reconstruction, many Americans know very little about it, and what they do know is often outdated or inaccurate. Historians once portrayed the period as a failure and defined it narrowly as the years between 1865 and 1876. Now they see its broad triumphs and also its long reach. During this period, Americans debated profound questions. What did freedom mean? What kind of country would this be? What kind of political system should it govern? And what were the rights of citizenship, and who could be a citizen? They struggled earnestly, if not always successfully, to build a nation of free and equal citizens. Small wonder that Reconstruction is often called the country's second founding. To this day, the outcomes of the vast political and social changes of the Reconstruction era remain visible all across the landscape. Now, the events, peoples, and ideas associated with Reconstruction occurred across the southern parts of the United States and also across the nation. There's not one singular site that represents the entirety of the era, and as such, the National Park Service has created the Reconstruction Era National Historic Network. Now, the John D. Dingell Jr. Conservation Management and Recreation Act was signed into law on March 12, 2019, and outlined the creation of the Reconstruction Era National Historic Network. This network, managed by Reconstruction Era National Historic Park in South Carolina, includes sites and programs that are affiliated with the Reconstruction era, but aren't necessarily managed by the National Park Service themselves. The network facilitates and reviews Reconstruction era-related research in collaboration with affiliated sites and programs through agreements and partnerships with these sites. This network is nationwide and works to provide opportunities for visitors to connect with the stories of the Reconstruction. A growing national collection of 97 public and private sites and programs in 27 different states provide education, historical interpretation, and research related to the American Reconstruction era from 1861 to 1900. The NPS accepts applications for inclusion on a rolling basis. Now, this network is comprised of not just national park sites, but public places like schools, churches, districts, and those where people who had some association with Reconstruction resided, like James A. Garfield's home, and areas where events key to the Reconstruction occurred. Now, these are all part of the network, and today we will do an armchair tour of the Reconstruction Era National Historic Network and learn the process to nominate a site that you think should be included. Now, the sites in the network themselves are categorized under 6 different themes, being land and labor, African American institution building, enfranchisement/new democracy, civil rest/violence, federal power, and modernizing/remaking the South. Later in this presentation, we'll look into more specifically at how a site gets on the network, but for now, keep this in mind, that all Reconstruction era sites must be associated with events that have made a significant contribution to and are identified with or outstandingly represent the broad national patterns of U.S. history, and from which an understanding and appreciation of those patterns may be gained, or are associated with the lives of persons nationally significant in the history of the United States, or represent some great idea or ideal of the American people. The resource can be a property, either a physical location of an event or a location associated with a significant individual or group, a facility, locations that may or may not have existed during Reconstruction but are dedicated to collecting and interpreting this history of the Reconstruction, as well as a program, either a site, tour, performance, educational curriculum, or other way that the history of the Reconstruction era is presented or explained to the public. Now, sites have also been already listed in or determined eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, can also be administered by the National Park Service. This is the official list of the nation's historic places worthy of preservation, though not necessarily a site also part of the National Park Service. Now, the next few slides will show how current national park sites with significant Reconstruction era events, individuals, and or ideas tie to the network themes. Framing national parks within these themes allow us to consider what we thought we knew about a particular site and perhaps see them in a different light. Now, Reconstruction transformed both land and labor relations in the American South. As 4 million former slaves gained their freedom, they pressed demands for land upon the federal government, gaining temporary control over tracts of land along the Atlantic coast and elsewhere. Where they could not get land, freed people sought to remake their labor relationships, and sometimes with their former owners themselves, so that they could capture some of the essential characteristics of freedom, including wages and self-determination. And this slide in particular is about Esther Napoleon Lottery Bartley, also known as Aunt Easter to family and her friends, who was a former slave at the White Oak Plantation in Jacksonville, Florida. A property associated with an event, person, or idea from this era may be eligible if it made a significant contribution to the renegotiation of labor relationships after slavery, African Americans' quest to own land in either rural or urban locations, and the historical origins and development of sharecropping and other forms of agricultural characteristics in the U.S. South during the period of 1861 to 1901. Now, newly free African Americans sought to build upon their existing social relationships by constructing legal, permanent institutions. Central to their aspirations were cultivating family relationships and building schools, churches, and fraternal and sororal societies. In such societies, African Americans developed new skills and cultivated social bonds that helped to sustain their communities. Pictured on this slide is the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, and it was opened by Booker T. Washington in 1881. And this school was built on a former 500-acre farm bought by Washington for $700. And Thrasher Hall is the pictured building, and it was completed in 1893 by students and teachers using bricks they made on campus. Now, among its graduates was George Washington Carver, and the Institute prepared freed black men to work in the fields of education, agriculture, medicine, and science. Now, a property associated with an event, person, idea from this era may be eligible if it made a significant contribution to the creation, stabilization, or growth of African American institutions, including but not limited to families, schools, including primary, secondary, or post-secondary, churches, and fraternal and sororal societies. Now, with the passage of the Military Reconstruction Acts of 1867 and then the 15th Amendment in 1870, freed people entered formal politics in huge numbers, casting votes that helped shape presidential elections and perhaps even more so crucially, selecting local officials who regulated their daily lives. Now, drawing upon political and moral views developed under slavery, freed people emerged quickly as relatively cohesive, powerful participants in political life and eventually elected thousands of local officials. This transformation of democracy remade not only African American life, but the United States more broadly. And pictured here is the Boston African American National Historic Site in Boston, Massachusetts. Now, Lewis Hayden was an escaped slave, a radical abolitionist, and an Underground Railroad operative, and he chaired the organizing committee for the April 14th, 1870 celebrations on the 15th Amendment. On that day, African Americans organized and led a celebration of their citizenship, filling the public heart of Boston, and Hayden's home is part of the Boston African American National Historic Site. Now, a property with an event, person, or idea from this era may be eligible if it made a significant contribution towards efforts to bring universal manhood suffrage to the former Confederacy, including voter registration and voting itself, as well as legislation at the state or federal level that promoted universal manhood suffrage, or the creation and enforcement of either the 13th, 14th, or 15th Amendments, as well as the debates about the extension of voting rights towards women at this time. Now, the rapid transformation of freed people from slaves to political participants and the extraordinary reconstruction of Southern labor and law inspired a furious, violent counterattack by some white Southerners who sought to restore their power by force. Assaults upon freed people attempting to vote or organize politically grew with vigilante groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, the White Legion, and the Red Shirts, who initiated a reign of terror in the South that culminated with the disenfranchisement of almost all freed people and the construction of a segregated Jim Crow South. Now, pictured on this slide is the Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site in St. Louis, Missouri. And Grant himself is thematically connected to so many different aspects of the Reconstruction efforts. As illustrated here, as president, he signed the Ku Klux Klan Act in 1871, which was intended to ensure the protection of life and property for all citizens, regardless of their backgrounds. Now, a property associated with an event, person, or idea from this era can be eligible if it made a significant contribution towards efforts to suppress African Americans and or white unionist votes through violence and intimidation, the violent overthrow of duly elected Republican governments, or violence against African Americans that were not directly connected towards politics. Now, Reconstruction also remade the national government itself. The 3 constitutional amendments ratified during Reconstruction created new templates for federal power and in some respects represent a second founding of our country, one that remade many of its basic constitutional premises. While the ultimate power of federal authority was clear, the exact contours of national and state power was subject to debate, and Americans argued vigorously over the role and size of the U.S. Army and the newly formed Justice Department, as well as more broadly over the place of the federal government in daily life. Now, James A. Garfield National Historic Site, right here in Mentor, Ohio, was thematically tied to the Reconstruction era itself through James Garfield, because he was a vocal abolitionist before the Civil War, as well as joining up with the United States Army to help defend the Union and abolish slavery. He also served in Congress for 17 years, all of it during Reconstruction, and there he fought for and supported legislation that protected civil rights, male suffrage, and physical safety of the formerly enslaved. He was a key leader during debates over how to stop the Ku Klux Klan, as well as the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Now, in terms of federal power, a property associated with an event, person, or idea from this era may be eligible if it made a significant contribution towards the debates about the appropriate extent of federal power in the southern states, the role of the U.S. Army and Navy in Reconstruction, or the creation of new legislation and constitutional amendments that helped reshape the relationship between the U.S. government and the local and state governments. Now, Reconstruction was a moment when the South's economy and institutions were remade. An old South built upon slavery could not simply be updated to fit in a new world of emancipation, but instead had to be rebuilt from its foundations. Despite the turmoil of constructing new labor systems, Reconstruction was also a period of economic growth and development as Southern governments invested dramatically in railroads, education, and other forms of public services. While the Southern economy and culture remained stymied by segregation and the limits imposed on public debates and public works, Reconstruction established some of the infrastructure and processes that would shape the new South of the 20th century. An example of this is Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park in Chickamauga, Georgia. Now, formerly enslaved Mark Thrash, also known as Uncle Mark to battlefield visitors in the 1930s, was an icon in the early years of this park. His small cabin was near the site of General Rosecrans' headquarters, and Thrash crafted an image of himself that allowed him to thrive as an African American in the post-Reconstruction era. In doing so, he promoted the preservation of Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park and inspired people to care for and learn about the battles that took place there. Now, modernizing/remaking the South. A property can be associated with this pillar if the event, person, or idea from this era may be eligible, if it made a significant contribution towards the history of modernization in the region, as well as areas including railroad development, public education, and the New South movement. Now that we have an idea of the qualifications a site must meet to be on the Reconstruction network, connected to the 6 themes through an event, an individual, or an idea, let's explore the network sites that are part of the National Park Service. As mentioned at the start, not all 97 sites that are part of the network itself are under the National Parks umbrella. And I'll let you in on a little bit of insider information. The National Park System combines the first 2 letters of a site's first name with the first 2 letters of the second name into an acronym for internal references. For example, the James A. Garfield site is JAGA, and the Cuyahoga Valley site is CUVA. So the Reconstruction Network is referred to as RENE, R-E-N-E. I don't know if that's actually how it's pronounced. I'm sure I butchered it slightly. So I'm going to continue to call it the Reconstruction Network, just to keep it nice and simple. Now, some sites out in Washington include the Fort Vancouver National Historic Site. During Reconstruction, African American soldiers served on its garrison. Out in Idaho, we have the Nez Perce National Historical Park, as well as Big Hole National Battlefield, which interpret the Reconstruction era conflicts between the Nez Perce and the U.S. military forces commanded by General Oliver Howard, who had commanded the Freedmen's Bureau and, in part, modeled the reservation system after the Freedmen's Bureau. In Montana, we have Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument. As U.S. citizens moved west during Reconstruction, they often clashed with American Indian tribes, and The Little Bighorn Battlefield interprets the role of Western expansion during Reconstruction, and the battle affected the critical election of 1876. Now in Wyoming, we have the Yellowstone National Park. During Reconstruction, federal jurisdiction expanded in a variety of ways, including the birth of national parks in 1872, when President Grant signed legislation creating Yellowstone. In Utah, we have Golden Spike National Historic Site, which interprets the role of labor and railroads in shaping Western expansion during the Reconstruction era. In Nebraska, we have Homestead National Monument, which interprets the massive rush of immigration and land redistribution that occurred in response to the passage of federal legislation. During Reconstruction, many people, including African Americans, moved west to take advantage of land opportunities and to escape the tensions of Reconstruction violence and disputes occurring back east. Now in Kansas, we have Fort Larned National Historic Site, which was a projection of U.S. jurisdiction in the Great Plains during Reconstruction, and at times was garrisoned by African American Buffalo soldiers. Now, Fort Scott National Historic Site, also in Kansas, served as a supply depot for U.S. military forces in the West and was a recruiting depot for African American soldiers. For much of the post-Civil War period, the fort was home to an African American community and a freedman school that counted George Washington Carver as among its students. Also in Kansas is Nicodemus National Historic Park, which preserves a Reconstruction-era freedmen settlement on the Great Plains of Kansas. Formerly enslaved people, mostly from Kentucky, established the community as parts of their efforts to move west and escape anti-black violence of the Reconstruction-era South. Now in Missouri, we have the previously mentioned Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site, which preserves the home of Grant and who served as the President of the U.S. for much of the Reconstruction era, and oversaw the passage implementation of federal legislation designed to protect formerly enslaved people. In Arkansas, we have the Fort Smith National Historic Site, interpreting the role of U.S. courts in enforcing federal authority in Reconstruction-era Arkansas, and surrounding Native American territories. In addition, Fort Smith was home to a freedman community and hospital. In Louisiana, we have Cane River Creole National Historic Park, interpreting the story of freedmen that remained on the land as sharecroppers during Reconstruction and the conflict with former enslavers during this era. Jean-Pierre Fazand was a free man of color who owned the Chalmette battlefield. After the Civil War, he divided the land and sold it to formerly enslaved people, making Jean Lafayette National Historic Park and preserve a unique site to learn about land reform that occurred during the Reconstruction era. Now moving on to Texas, we have Fort Davis National Historic Site. Now that was garrisoned by African American Buffalo soldiers, and it's important because during the Reconstruction era, one of the economic opportunities available to African American men was military service, often enlisting into these groups that became known as the Buffalo Soldiers. Now here in Ohio, we have the Charles Young Buffalo Soldiers National Monument, which tells the story of Charles Young, an African-American man who rose to prominence during the Reconstruction era military, as well as, of course, our own James A. Garfield National Historic Site mentioned earlier. Now in Kentucky, we have Camp Nelson National Monument, preserving the site of a major training facility for the U.S. colored troops, as well as a contraband camp for formerly enslaved people. During the Reconstruction era, many of the tour guides of what would later become Mammoth Cave National Park were formerly enslaved people. These first rangers provide a glimpse into the issues of Reconstruction era labor opportunities. Now in Tennessee, we have the previously mentioned Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park, which interprets the story of the battles that took place there and preserves a Reconstruction-era home that was constructed shortly after the U.S. Civil War. The Andrew Johnson National Historic Site, also located here in Tennessee, preserves the home of Andrew Johnson, who was president during the early years of Reconstruction. Also in Tennessee again, Stones River National Battlefield and National Cemetery became an African-American community that thrived throughout the Reconstruction era, and the park actively interprets the stories that took place there. Now in Mississippi, we have the Natch National Historical Park, which interprets a wide array of Reconstruction stories and resources. As Natch was a hotbed of Reconstruction era activity and was home to Hiram Revels, the first African American that was elected to the United States Congress during the Reconstruction. The Corneth Interpretive Center, part of Shiloh National Military Park, preserves and interprets the site of a large contraband camp and freedmen community in northern Mississippi. Also in Mississippi, we have Vicksburg National Military Park. Like many other battlefields and cemeteries in the Deep South, it was home to a large freedmen community, and the city was garrisoned by the United States colored troops during the early years of Reconstruction. In Alabama, we have the previously mentioned Tuskegee Institute National Historic Site, preserving the historically black college and university that remains active there today. In West Virginia, during the American Civil War, Harper's Ferry became home to a large contraband camp, and after the war became a thriving freedmen community. Today it's Harper's Ferry National Historical Park, and the park itself includes Storer College, an educational institution for African Americans that was established during Reconstruction. Now down in Florida, we have Dry Tortugas National Park, which preserves the site of Fort Jefferson, which served as a prison for Reconstruction-era political prisoners, most notably Dr. Samuel Mudd. The fort remained part of the garrison of the Deep South until 1874. Also in Florida is the Gulf Islands National Seashore, which preserves the sites of several coastal fortifications along the Gulf Coast, including Fort Pickens. Now, these fortifications provided the military governance to create and support freedmen communities. Also covered earlier today in Florida, the Ticomaquan Ecological and Historical Preserve, which includes Kingsley Plantation. This antebellum plantation includes original slave cabins where enslaved people lived and worked before and after emancipation, and the park interprets the struggles of freed people to acquire lands in the Reconstruction era Florida. Now in Georgia, we have Andersonville National Historic Site. In 1865, formerly enslaved people moved into the old stockade there, and the American Missionary Association operated a freedmen's school in a prison hospital, and formerly enslaved people organized Emancipation Day services in 1869 in the cemetery. Shortly afterwards, the Ku Klux Klan attacked the freedmen community, and by the end of Reconstruction, the black community had been driven away by Jim Crow-era policies. Now, after the Civil War, tensions emerged between planters and formerly enslaved people over issues of land ownership and labor, especially on the Cumberland Island National Seashore, and the freedmen erected a small church which still stands today in the park. Now, the Fort Pulaski National Monument was captured by the U.S. forces in the spring of 1862, an event which served as the impetus for General David Hunter to issue a series of orders formally emancipating the enslaved people of coastal Georgia and South Carolina. The fort was later garrisoned by the United States colored troops in 1866. Fort Frederica National Monument on St. Simons Island in Georgia was home to a thriving black community during Reconstruction, including the family of journalist and religious leader Robert S. Abbott. Recent archaeological work done by park staff has identified the location of a freedman cemetery, and the park includes a monument erected by Abbott in memory of his family who lived and died at the site during Reconstruction. Now in North Carolina, we have the Fort Raleigh National Historic Site, which is best known for its rich colonial history. But during and after the Civil War, a large freedmen community emerged around this site. Now, in New Hampshire, the Shaw Memorial was one of the most significant monuments erected during Reconstruction and explored the role of emancipation and black participation in the U.S. Civil War. And the St. Gaudens National Historic Park interprets the process of developing this Reconstruction-era monument and its memory. Now, in Massachusetts, we have the Boston African American National Historic Site, which interprets the story of Boston's African American community during the Reconstruction era, including the Shaw Memorial and the emancipationist memory of the Civil War. I mentioned the Lewis Hayden home as part of this group of historical places located in Boston. Now, one of the most important job opportunities for formerly enslaved people and their descendants was military service. Bearing arms in defense of the nation was widely seen as a means to secure citizenship, and many of those arms were produced at the Springfield Armory, now known as Springfield Armory National Historic Site. Now, in New York, although most famous for her work before the U.S. Civil War, Harriet Tubman also worked to ensure that formerly enslaved people had opportunities after slavery, and the Harriet Tubman National Historic Park preserves Tubman's home, which was developed as a group home for formerly enslaved by the end of Reconstruction. Now, the Women's Rights National Historic Park interprets the fight for women's suffrage and rights, both key components of citizenship debates during the Reconstruction era. Also in New York, the Vanderbilt Mansion National Historic Site interprets the social and economic changes that occurred during the Reconstruction era as the nation began its push to industrialization. Now, in Pennsylvania, we have Gettysburg National Military Park, and it was at the dedication ceremony of this national cemetery that President Lincoln expressed that the post-war world would see a new birth of freedom. During the later years of the 1800s, African American visitors, including military veterans, visited the site to celebrate an emancipationist memory of the U.S. Civil War. Now, in Maryland, we have the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historic Park, which interprets the critical role that Harriet Tubman played in assisting people make the transition from slavery to freedom. Now, also in Maryland here, during the Reconstruction era, Clara Barton's work with the Missing Soldiers Office took her into the Deep South, where places like Andersonville, she carried news of emancipation. Clara Barton National Historic Site interprets her contributions to American society throughout the Reconstruction era. Also in Maryland is Antietam National Battlefield, which interprets the importance of the Emancipation Proclamation as a crucial moment in the Civil War and Reconstruction periods. In South Carolina, we have Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie National Historic Parks, which interpret Civil War and Reconstruction era Charleston, including the story of Robert Smalls, early emancipation, celebrations in the city, as well as freedmen activities at the close of the Civil War. Established in 1870 by Bathsheba Benedict, Benedict College is located in Columbia, South Carolina, and during Reconstruction it trained teachers and preachers, but the curriculum eventually grew to include more traditional academic and trade professions. Charles Pinckney National Historic Site is primarily a site associated with the Revolutionary period a century before Reconstruction. However, the park actively preserves and interprets the experiences of Reconstruction-era African Americans who remained around the city, as well as the experiences of the Gula Geechee communities during this era. Now, during the Civil War, the floodplain and swamplands that made up the Congaree National Park became a haven for people escaping enslavement and became a freedmen community during the Reconstruction era. Now, the Reconstruction era National Historical Park preserves and interprets sites throughout Beaufort County that are significant to the Reconstruction era. Housed within this park is the Penn School on St. Helena Island in Beaufort County. The Penn School was first established in 1862 as one of the first schools for formerly enslaved people at the dawn of the Reconstruction era. Today, the Penn Center preserves the historic campus and interprets the importance of education in Gullah culture on the Sea Islands. This park also manages the Reconstruction Era National Historical Network as a whole. Now, in the District of Columbia, we have the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site, which preserves and interprets the home of Frederick Douglass and Douglass's role as a Reconstruction Era champion for civil rights. Also located in D.C. is the Carter G. Woodson Home for National Historic Site, interpreting the life of Carter G. Woodson, who was born during the Reconstruction era and became a champion for educational opportunities for formerly enslaved people as well as their descendants. Also in D.C., we have Ford's Theater National Historic Site, interpreting the significance of Abraham Lincoln's assassination, a tragedy that reverberated throughout the Reconstruction era and changed the trajectory of governmental policy. In Virginia, we have Petersburg National Battlefield, interpreting the role of the United States colored troops in the destruction of slavery, but also is the site of Reconstruction-era communities in and around the city. Now, after the Civil War, formerly enslaved people found job opportunities working to recover remains at what is now Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park, and worked with the National Cemetery there. Now, the surrender of Robert E. Lee's Army at Appomattox Courthouse National Historical Park helped mark the end of the Civil War and began a nationwide transition from slavery to freedom. In 1863, the United States Army established a Freedmen's Village at Arlington House, and after the Civil War, this village was managed by the Freedmen's Bureau and later other governmental agencies. Now, it closed in 1900 at the end of the Reconstruction era. The Booker T. Washington National Monument preserves the farm where Booker T. Washington grew up and lived shortly after the Civil War. In 1865, a U.S. soldier read the Emancipation Proclamation to Washington and other now formerly enslaved people. Washington went on to become an advocate for African American education throughout Reconstruction and beyond. Now, the Cedar Creek and Belle Grove National Historical Park preserves a plantation site and interprets the experiences of African Americans there before, during, and after the Civil War. The Fort Monroe National Monument preserves and interprets a wide array of Reconstruction-era stories, including some of the earliest efforts to transition from slavery to freedom, and a large freedmen community, as well as the imprisonment of Jefferson Davis during the early years of Reconstruction. Now, the Maggie Walker National Historic Site interprets the African American experience of Reconstruction-era Richmond. Now, the application process for the Reconstruction-era National Historic Network is relatively simple, but the team vetting the applications have no simple task. The research team must verify all the information given. Especially time-consuming is the justification section that asks how a potential site meets the criteria for inclusion into the network. Using the criterion we went through several slides ago, shown on this screen right now is the relevant excerpts from our application at the James A. Garfield site that we submitted to be a part of the network ourselves. Now, the question you might be wondering, is it all worth the effort? Yes, it is, to be short with it. Here are some of the benefits to being a member of the Reconstruction Network. You gain national recognition, use of the program logo in promotional materials, technical assistance with the site, as well as grant assistance, and assistance with educational resources. You also get opportunities to conduct research and scholarship opportunities on the site. Now, many people assume certain things when getting involved with the federal government, especially when it comes to funding. So please note that the network isn't a funding source as a whole, as well as it isn't a bureaucracy with reporting requirements or the need to follow National Park Service rules, and we're not forcing sites to change their procedures. This note about bureaucracy and procedural changes is an important point. If you're a small local site managed by a group of volunteers, you do not want to hear that inclusion in the network will mean paperwork, reporting requirements, or red tape. Although the National Park Service manages dozens of sites within the network, you can see many gaps in the 6 themes, and these gaps are precisely why the National Park Service accepts sites outside of the service itself to be included as part of the network. There's not a feasible way to include every site or even a majority of the sites under the National Park Service umbrella. Now, I would encourage you to visit the Reconstruction Era National Historic Network to explore the complex portfolio of places within the network and to consider what sites you would like to be included in the future. Anyone willing to share their ideas on that at all, on what sites you think should be included that we haven't before?
What about cemeteries where they were buried? I know a lot of them were buried on plantations, but what about that? Is that possible, realistic?
Yeah, I mean, if locations that have places like that still present, put in the application work and such, that would very much fall into the category of being part of the criteria for this network.
I know, like Madison's plantation has a cemetery where they were buried there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what about around like Ohio, places, well, not Ohio, but you know, where the plantations were and so on, they were buried there, and it's wondering if some of them could be part of the park, this reconstruction and so on.
I think it would depend on the site itself and how much of it remains. But I mean, if you can, in the paperwork, justify the inclusion into the network as a whole, then yeah, cemeteries like that on former plantation sites would very much fall under the potential umbrella for the inclusion in this network.
What about underground railroad sites?
Yeah, that's another one that would fall into the inclusion of the umbrella for the network itself.
Any of them in this?
There's a separate network just for Underground Railroad. There's also, so this is Reconstruction Era National Historic Network. The National Park Service also administers the Underground Railroad Network, the Freedom National Historic Network, that those sites would be part of specifically.
Yes?
When you apply once, is it for life, or do you need to reapply on a periodic basis?
I believe once you get into the network, you're good to go. It's just the initial approval with the application. It's not a reoccurring thing where you need to keep justifying your inclusion or not. Yeah.
You had listed one, I know you said this was just a sample of the many examples. There was another one that you listed in Ohio, and do you happen to know where the next closest one would be in Ohio after the Garfield Museum?
The Charles Young
Well, Charles Young Buffalo Soldiers is in Wilberforce, Ohio.
Which is,
southern Ohio.
yeah.
They're probably, though, because again, these don't all need to be units of the national.
Yeah, the ones we mentioned in that were just ones that also fall under the National Park umbrella.
Right. So if you go to the website there on the screen, I'm sure there's probably a listing of every site that is part of the network, so you could see what is on there in Ohio that is closest to, say, Mentor or Lake County or wherever you prefer. But yeah, Charles Young is down sort of in southern Ohio, Wilberforce. So I'm sure there are other sites that are not National Park Service sites that are also on the network here in Ohio.
Well, if that's all the questions for now, I'd like to thank everyone for coming out and attending today, and I hope you enjoyed the talk we had given. It's always nice to have this kind of level of community showing up for events that are hosted here at the library, especially ones that are in partnership with the Garfield House. But just regardless, glad to have the community coming out for things like this.